This free program is paid for by the listener members of KPFK. If you're not already a member, consider joining with us and keep
KPFK.org. We're your host, Selena Alvarez.
I'm Melissa Chiprin.
We will be right back after these KPFK announcements with Alyce Laviolette, MS, MFCC, a pioneer in ending interpersonal violence against women that includes working with the batterers.
Now we're going to talk with our next guest, Alyce Laviolette. Before we get into this, it's going to be about the batterers and domestic violence, but I'd like to let our listeners know that at times it is good to hear and to talk, and it can be healing and helpful, but at other times this can be a time that might, if you're not ready, you know, it can be a trigger. And so if this is not the right time for you, you know, you might want to consider turning our show off for right now. I'd like to give the National Domestic Violence Hotline, which is staffed 24 hours a day by trained counselors. That is 1-800-799-SAFE. So joining us tonight is Alyce Laviolette, MS, MFCC. She works with anger management, domestic violence counseling for survivors and perpetrators, gender issues, and an expert witness. Alyce Laviolette has worked with battered women since 1978, first as an advocate at Women's Shelter in Long Beach, and then in private practice. In 1979, she funded Alternatives to Violence, one of the first programs in the country for spouse abusers. Ms. Laviolette has developed training programs for the Los Angeles County and California State Departments of Probation and for the Orange and Los Angeles County Department of Children and Family Services. She has published articles, and she has written a great book. One of Sage Publications' best-selling books is called It Could Happen to Anyone, Why Battered Women Stay. Welcome, Alyce.
Hi, how are you?
I'm doing good. How are you this evening? Thank you for joining us. I know you're in the middle of group, and you stepped out so that you can come join us on Feminist Magazine.
Actually, my group wanted to join us, too.
That would actually be a good conversation. What did your group think when you told them, because you're working with the batterers?
They said that they could help me on this this phone call, that they could be my consultants on the call. But actually, I think a couple of them would be who have really done some changing, that it would be good to hear from some of those men.
Well, let's talk first about that because, right away, first and foremost, victim safety must be the standard for all batter intervention programs, and the primary concern would be for their safety. That's correct?
Yeah, and in fact, I think any time that you're doing work with intimate partner violence, that you're looking at seeing not just the person.
I'm sorry, Alyce, can you speak up just a bit?
Yeah, sure. Can you hear me better now?
Great.
That not only are you looking at the person in the room with you who's in your group, but you're also really looking at the family and the community as your clients as well.
Now, originally, when you took this position, because you'd been working with, survivors it's been 30 years now?
Yes.
Right. And so originally when you took this position, you were not really too interested. You've seen the horrible after effects from working with survivors. So what happened? What made you decide to work? And also, how have things evolved since you have been working with the batterers?
Well, I'd been working at the shelter for about 6 months, and I was a graduate student and a single mother with 2 children. I needed a paid position, and there was no paid position besides this one. And so I took it with the idea of doing the program design, but not really doing the program itself. But when you work for a shelter and you design a program, you do it also. And so I started working with the men, and I was pretty naive about it, although one of the things I did that I think is very important to do, and I think sometimes we lose that, is we don't talk to the people who are most affected by what's going on. I went to the women in the shelter, and I asked them what I needed to know about working with their partners. And I got a lot of information that way. I also got a lot of information from the women about their partner's childhoods and their backgrounds, and most of the women described the men that they were in relationship with as having very horrific childhoods. So I came at it from several different positions. I'd made contact with other abusers programs, and there were about 3 or 4 around the country at the time, and I made contact with them. And philosophically, they were a little different, and I got a lot of information from them, and I sort of plowed ahead with the idea that I was not a trained therapist, but I knew that these folks didn't know how to behave in a family. And I thought, well, I can bring that to the table because I have a family that loves each other and gets along, and I know the dynamics of a healthy family. I know something about domestic violence, and I know that you need to confront people on their behavior, but that you also need to be connected to them to be able to confront them effectively.
And there's a few things there. First, I want to go back to, when you brought up that you found that this common link was they came from a violent family, and it's probably on a continuum, which would affect most likely the way they then abuse later. Is that a fair statement?
That their childhoods affected what they did later?
No, the continuum. Like if it was a harsher, if it was a harsher violence?
Right. That if the more severe batterers, there's a more one-to-one connection. In other words, if somebody comes from a very violent home, they're much more likely to repeat the violence. But people who are exposed to a higher level of aggression than in, say, a healthy family, they're still affected by it, but they can be affected at a lower level.
And then there's also this fine line, because you don't want to let the batterer use that as an excuse, because that's part of the part of the denial is all the blaming their family and minimizing things and justifying things. So it's like a fine line.
Well, actually, most of them don't bring their families in as the excuse. In fact, many of them don't even see that they were abused as children. They see themselves as being disciplined, even if they were hit with wires and hit with boards and all this sort of thing. They don't see themselves that way. They're more likely, where the blame is attached, is more likely at their adult partner, and they're seeing that they did something wrong. That's where they're more likely to start blaming someone else and externalizing things, denying things, is with the adult partner. But they don't tend to pull their childhoods up as an excuse.
And it's interesting. Talk to us. You also mentioned about the connecting, and there's about this theory of the theory of connection equals collusion. But yet you said you need to, at some level, connect to help.
Well, there is a sort of political rhetoric that if you connect with these guys that you'll wind up colluding with them. I think one of the reasons for me, besides the fact that I got into this work to work on violence against women, but I keep working with the victims, and I think that really helps me not to collude. And I work with a facilitator in groups, so the two of us work on not doing that. However, I think you have to connect with somebody. If anybody who's ever been in therapy would know that if the person who's working with them does not make a connection with them, they're not going to listen to them. They have to feel like you care about them and that you believe they can change. And if they don't believe that, I think they're not going to respond to you in the same way, no matter what kind of technique you use.
And let's get into that, because battered women's advocates and other community members who are part of the movement to end domestic abuse of women struggle with a mixed outlook on intervention programs for abusive men. A well-run program can contribute in many ways to the movement, while a poorly run program can actively endanger abused women's shelter batterers from accountability and be tools of batterers' manipulation. So talk to us about what works and what doesn't.
Well, I think there are a lot of different things that work. One of the things that people really don't talk about, they talk about whether to use curriculum or not to use curriculum, whether to use time limited or not. I think the person that's doing the program makes more difference in some ways than the program itself. That if you are not a person who can connect to other people, if you're not a person who has empathy for other people, if you're not a person who feels like you can confront in a way without shaming, there are a lot of those kinds of things. But I think in my program, what I sort of do, I think that's different, is we deal with the trauma that the perpetrator feels, but we also, other men, we have an ongoing program. So, for instance, right now I have a man who's been in my program for 7 years, all the way down to people who've just started. And when you're dealing with that, you find that the men do some of the best confrontation with the other men as well, not just the people that are facilitating the group. Also, it's their group. One of the things I want them to know is that, a prevention is being able to ask for what you want. If you need help, we want you to ask for help that week. We want you to take responsibility to ask for what you want. If you, if somebody is monopolizing the time in group and you need time in group, then you have to jump in and ask for time in group. You have to be able to confront. It's practice. It's practice for real life because they're in a group with other folks, and some of these other folks are irritating. So how do I confront one of the other guys in group, and how do I think about what I'm going to say so this other guy doesn't get mad at me, and how do I time it right? It's all things that they have to learn about to use when they're dealing with their partners. We also do a lot of work on empathy. That two of the things we know that reduce violent behavior and aggressive behavior and even anger are empathy and empowerment. And when people can understand how somebody else feels and when they have a way to solve problems and they're not feeling powerless, that they handle things better and it de-escalates rage and anger.
Well, and as going back to what you said, it has a lot to do with the facilitator. You actually created a bill for how people should be trained. Can you tell us about that?
I'm sorry, I didn't hear you.
When you originally started, you said a lot of the differences is not necessarily the program, but who the facilitators are, how they implement the work. And so you yourself, though, have actually had created a bill for how the people who work with the batterers, how they should be trained.
Yeah, actually, we created a bill that is part of the penal code. There's a penal code that deals with domestic violence perpetrators, and an addendum or an amendment to that penal code is how facilitators who do the work have to be trained. And what happened was a coalition of probation officers, shelter workers, and perpetrators groups came up with what they thought should be part of a basic training. And I worked with Senator Alan Lowenthal to put that into legislation. And so we have a 40-hour training that's required for anybody, whether they're licensed or not, so that what we found was that people oftentimes who are licensed feel like they ought to be able to do this work even though they haven't had training in it. And we were concerned about protecting the rights of grassroots facilitators, but also about everybody having training. So there's a 40-hour training that includes victims issues, cross-cultural, substance abuse and domestic violence, ethical concerns, working in groups, intake, those kinds of things. And then, in addition to that, anybody who's going to do this work needs 104 hours of supervision in not less than 6 months. And every year they need 16 continuing education units. And we wanted to do that so people would continue with their training, and so people would be supervised also by what was considered a seasoned facilitator, and that was somebody who had a minimum of 3 years of experience doing group.
Is there enough funding?
There's no funding. The way we get paid is through our clients, And the law about domestic violence, running domestic violence groups, says that every group has to do a sliding scale. And so we do a sliding scale. So actually, depending on the group, depending on some groups are part of an agency, and so their funding is, their rates are controlled. I'm in a private practice, so I can sort of set my own rates. And if somebody seems really interesting and really motivated, I can do a really low fee. I have a range that I can go.
Alyce, hi, it's Selena. I just wanted to let you know that as I'm listening to you speak, I work in social services myself, and I have for 15 years.
Wow.
And I really, really want to commend you for what you're doing, because being in the field myself, I'm seeing a very appalling and horrifying trend of people who are not only on the front lines but also in the administrative level who just don't get it. They don't understand the importance of focusing on behavior and not the person.
Yeah.
And that empathy and that trust and all this, the training and everything that you're trying to do to really bring these facilitators and these folks up to speed with what you're trying to do here is absolutely to be commended, because more and more social service agencies in this county alone, LA County, need to step up the game and really try to understand what it is that needs to do to help people change behavior.
One of the things really concerning to me is that people are using research as a way, and it tends to be from administration down. It's kind of like, without having hands-on experience, you don't ask the people who are doing it what needs to be done. They look at research, and research has incredible limitations, but people don't know it. And so they don't, even the research that talks, most of the research says that at some level, batterers has some positive effect, and they don't know why, because the research doesn't really explore that. But the only really long longitudinal study was done by Ed Gondorf, and it was a 4-year follow-up, and he actually asked battered women, do you feel safer now? And a large number of the women felt safer.
How is that evaluated?
Well, the way they evaluate it is to ask the women themselves, to do interviews with them, and then they look at recidivism, most of the studies really only look at recidivism, and they look at it for a short term. So it's, in other words, was this person rearrested? Well, they could be abusive and not be rearrested, or they could be abusive and not reported again. Recidivism is not the best measure, but it's the easiest measure, so that's what people are using. What I'd like to see is qualitative measures, like, is this person learning something about empathy? Is this person learning how to back off and walk away when their partners are upset with them and they're upset with their partners? Does this person understand the impact of what they do on their partner and their children? Does this person get that they can be intimidating even if they're not physical? I want them to learn something about their own fuse and have some awareness. And when you look at transformational change, it doesn't happen in a year.
Right.
California is one of only 2 states in the country that actually even requires as much as a year. I just got back from speaking in New Jersey, and they've got groups that go for a weekend or 10 weeks.
And if women's lives really mattered, the numbers are epidemic. 1 out of every 3 women will...
Well, that's where you look at false research, too. What they're looking at, and this is actually the research that's been turned around on women. So in California, for instance, 3 years ago, we had 10 shelters sued for failure to provide services to battered men. And they were using the same research, which is actually not looking at who's battered. It's looking at isolated acts of aggression without a context. So we don't even know if it's a dynamic of domestic violence. They're not looking at psychological abuse. They're not looking at why somebody does it. It's the research isn't good. And when we have used that kind of research with battered women, what's happened is it's now been turned around on us because they ask women the same kinds of questions, and they find that women hit men. It doesn't mean that it's domestic violence. It means that it's an act of aggression without a context.
Can you elaborate a little bit more on what that means for our listeners?
Sure. Basically, the studies that are done have a list of aggressive acts, and they'll call people and say, have you ever done anything on this list with an intimate partner? Like, have you hit, pushed, shoved, grabbed, slapped? And they don't ask them why they did it, and they don't ask them what the result was, but they ask them if they've ever done it. And if they say yes, they're put in the aggressive group, and if they say no, they're put in the liars group, or the non-aggressive group. So what happens is then they're labeled without looking at what actually happened. For instance, the O.J. Simpson trial. We had been using statistics that said 50% of all women will be battered in their lifetime. That came from a study where researchers called people and said, have you ever hit, pushed, slapped, grabbed, punched, whatever, a partner in the course of an argument? And 50% of the men said they had done that. So we didn't read the research. We just said 50%. If 50% of men have done it, then 50% of women will be battered in their lifetime. Now, we didn't read the research to find out that nobody asked why they hit, or was it a repeated act, or was somebody hurt, or was somebody frightened, or did they just blow it off? We don't know any of that information. Nobody looked at the other side of that research till the O.J. Simpson trial. And when they did, they found that 52% of the women who they surveyed said they had done something physically aggressive to a male partner without a context. We don't know if it was self-defense. We don't know if it was initiated. We don't know what it was. And the L.A. Times printed in their view section, the headline was, "Why are we worried about battered women? There are more battered men."
Wow. Unfortunately, we are out of time. There's so much more to talk about, so we definitely want you to join us again. Let our listeners know how they can get in touch with you if they need help.
Well, I don't do I don't do email, but they can call me. My number is 562-493-1161, extension 2. And I do a private practice. I work with, I have two groups, one in West LA, one in Long Beach, for men who perpetrate aggression and violence in their intimate relationships. And then I have individual work with battered women. I also do expert witness for the court and training in public speaking. So.
Thank you so much, Alyce Laviolette, for joining us tonight.
Oh, you're very welcome.
We're wrapping up another edition of Feminist Magazine. For this week's program, we want to thank our engineer, Jose Juan Bustamante, and Melissa Chiprin for outreach and media relations, Kathy Spears, our wonderful web mistress, and in addition, we want to thank Patrick Miller for his behind-the-scenes support. Tonight's music was by Miria Makiba, Mama Africa. Feminist Magazine is produced by a collective of volunteers. If you'd like to get involved or send us comments about the show, email us at feministmagazine@yahoo.com or contact us via the station at kpfk.org. Feminist Magazine is archived and available as a download or podcast. Go to the audio archives at kpfk.org, click on shows, and scroll down